a time when they were engaged in something that brought them to the intersection of faith and politics, or religion and politics. Share a story that happened to you, or share a story that you've observed. And we've agreed to start from my left because I'm from the left coast. So.
Well, thank you very much, Randall. I was trying really hard to think about what the story would be that would get us into this conversation, at least from my perspective. And the one I'm going to tell you started about a year ago. So my work with Bread for the World is to engage Latino congregations around the country and denominational leaders in the work of ending hunger. That's what we do at Bread for the World. We lobby Congress to help end hunger. And so last year, I found myself with a group of mostly white evangelicals, but some Latino evangelicals, and we decided that we were going to walk 150 miles from the actual border with Mexico and San Diego, all the way to Los Angeles. And that we would make that a spiritual pilgrimage along the way to also leave behind a political statement each place that we went. One of the colleagues that went along that walk was a guy named Luis Avila. Luis is a young dreamer. Hold on a second, I wrote down what I think of Luis. Don't ever tell him. Luis is a queer, undocumented dreamer, a restaurant worker, and all-around underground subversive. Right? And he, being Catholic in origin, was nonetheless one of the point people for a group of Latino evangelicals in Southern California. Right? He's now part of something called the New Sanctuary Movement. The Sanctuary Movement started in the 80s to protect undocumented people coming to flee the wars in Central America, wars that sometimes the United States was complicit in, rather the United States was complicit in. and were seeking refuge. Mostly Catholics provided them refuge, but now it's evangelicals that are often stepping up to the place. And Luis, as this subversive queer brown person, is doing amazing work to make that happen. And that, to me, I just found that thoroughly inspiring, right? So that we walked about 150 miles throughout Southern California. Not the rough walk. We didn't do the walk that migrants actually take themselves. That would have been through the desert, and that's deadly. We went along the Pacific Coast Highway, which is a little bit safer until you get to Camp Pendleton. But anyway, I digress. My point is that I think Luis is a wonderful example of some of the work that started 20, 30, 40 years ago even for LGBT Latinos in our various expressions. And let me just mention some of the names involved in that because I have only a few minutes. I want to at least put those names and organizations out there on the table so we can come back and maybe talk a little bit more about what that experience was like at the time. Much of the struggle going on in communities was either about over-policing and concerns about policing our communities, policing our bedrooms, or in some cases it was about HIV and AIDS as that evolved, right? Those were the big concerns in our communities that made us come together. And some of the groups that eventually evolved out of there, let me mention two. One was YEGO, the National Latino Lesbian and Gay Organization, and the other one was ANCO. The one that I knew out of Texas was the Austin Lesbian and Gay Organization that still exists today. Names that were involved in that movement, Joe Perez. Joe was from Houston originally. I met him in Washington, D.C. on my first trip to a meeting with the Centers for Disease Control. Juan Garcia, Mario Solis Marich. Also, Letty Gomez, if you have not picked up a copy of her book, Queer Brown Voices, you should certainly take a look at that. It is definitely one part of our movement that's important to remember, and also Maria Limon. I want to mention some people that I think today are trying to find new ways of addressing this. One person in particular helped me a lot in thinking about our time here this week, and his name is Juan Gutierrez. Juan runs the Latino LGBT History Project in Washington, D.C., and Juan is an MCC member. And so Juan was just telling me his own story. He said, take this with you because it tells me something about where we've come. He says, at MCC this past year, we had a gathering of Latino people of faith in Washington, D.C., and MCC convened it, right? So now, I gotta tell you, I do Latino work, a lot of it. But I might think I'm inclusive, but apparently MCC does a better job of inclusivity because they found the Latino Buddhists, which also gather in Washington, D.C. And they found the Latino Santeros, the practitioners of Santeria, who are also gathering in D.C. And they brought them together into a conversation with other Latino Christians at MCC, and I thought, what a wonderful statement about how far we've come, right? That at least internally, we're beginning to have these much more fluid conversations about what it means to be us. So let me conclude there, and we can always come back to this later in the conversation. Thank you.
Perfect.
So I grew up in South Dakota, where Lutherans are made and then shipped out. And my theological underpinnings have less to do with Lutheranism, because Lutherans in South Dakota are like Jews in New York. We just are. And what I knew about theology was what I learned from my grandmother, who didn't sit down to eat. And she gave everyone dessert. And when the parents weren't looking, she'd go and eat whatever food the parents said, eat it or you don't get dessert. And that was my model of what Jesus did. And she liked peas. And I thought they were terrible. So she did what she could with things that were nutrients to her, and was taking an unbearable burden off of my plate. And so when I went to seminary in Berkeley, because God laughs at us, and I declared that my salvation from having to be a pastor would be that there would be no Lutheran seminaries that could accept me, I became homesick, and I discovered that as a family who was marked by the Depression, I miss poor people and the way that they think. And so I took a job, my first semester of seminary, eating with the homeless in the Polk Gulch area of San Francisco. And these are homeless folk who, in the 60s and 70s, went to San Francisco, found that there was no comfort for them, and had been kicked out of their homes for religious reasons. And I had a blessed life where my family did not do that, and felt like I needed to give back. But I did it with Franciscan nuns who would kick ass. And so I ate with people and learned their stories and became their grandmothers, though I was the opposite in age direction when one ought to be. And each year I would sleep on the streets for a week to feel in my bones what parts of the stories I was missing with the homeless. And like 12 years in, along came a very nerdy historian, Joey Plaster, who was doing oral histories and recording stories, and he needed a community person who didn't suck, who could be a part of the work that he wanted to do. And he taught me to do oral histories, and I taught him to be brave enough to talk in front of others. It didn't stick for him, but we did a project with queer homeless youth in San Francisco in 2011, where we took the actual writings of queer homeless youth from the 60s, the ones that Chuck Lewis was working with. And I studied deeply that time the way that pastors were organizing, how they would move politics by knowing where the mayor bought their gum, and were suggesting things, the ways that they would interact with the police department, and the ways that they could be advocates for people who they were not able to identify as for 40 more years, because they knew where their privilege was. And at the time, the pastors were less likely to be child molesters than the queer people, according to public understanding, and they could share their privilege and share their paychecks. And I did doctoral work around that area, and it ended up being a beautifully creative project. We took some of the youth and actually did a tour of the United States, where we would record the oral histories of LGBT folk in shelters, and then also speak at a church near that space to remind them why the homeless in San Francisco were their fault if they weren't willing to be as loud as the grumpy, angry religious folk on Fox News, and to try to connect them to the folk in need in their neighborhoods. And then I also did a study with folk who were eating in meal programs, the fine progressive meal programs where we don't talk about our faith because we know people are injured, we just feed them, but we do nothing else.
Ignore that fact.
And I learned that 86% of LGBTQ homeless adults, simply by eating food in a church space, felt like their spiritual wounds were healing. And over 90% wanted Bible study and lamented that no one would talk to them about God. And so I think my work kind of continues to find creative ways to lift up other people's stories and poetry and artwork, but particularly thinking about this beautiful moment we have right now where the people whose hair is the right color to make decisions in the church, when they were young, cared about the exact same issues as young people today, and yet young people don't necessarily remember that or know that, and how can we be the catalyst in the middle that allows beautiful work to happen when both the system says yes and the revolutionaries have the right idea.
I'm not going to fully participate in the panel, but I did want to share a story. And if you could just time me, because you seem good with technology, and I certainly am not. So again, for the last 25 years, before I moved to New York 2 years ago, I lived in California and actually worked with some of the folks you named. We were on the same staff together, and we were connected to the same seminary. I look forward to hearing my connections to the two of you. But I was intensely involved in Prop 8 and the campaign for same-sex marriage in California. And it's many, many ways. I wasn't going to talk about this because after marriage became legalized, I felt like we debriefed the things a lot. But it is a very helpful case study to me about faith, politics, and the tensions therein. So I worked for a different foundation then, and so I was very much involved in an overview place of sort of observing and supporting the strategy of the different organizations involved. And then I was very personally involved as well in a way that I didn't really think I would be, because I think of marriage as a heteronormative institution, but you know, sometimes things get thrust upon you. So there were several things that happened in what became a 5-year journey. So when Prop 8 was first introduced, Prop 8 was to place a constitutional ban in the California Constitution banning same-sex marriage. And so the timing was not chosen by LGBT advocates or allies. It was chosen by the opposition, and we were not ready. But sometimes, again, things get thrust upon you. And so the folks who first gathered to do the strategizing on the LGBT side were the mostly quote-unquote secular organizations. And as a funder, and in California, it's easier to be a gay man than to say that you're a practicing Christian. So they didn't know I was a practicing Christian. So, but I was around some of the strategy tables, and very early on, the group around the table, primarily white folks, but evenly distributed, probably men and women, made a decision not to include religious strategies for supporting same-sex marriage and the arguments that they would put forward. And as a closeted religious person around that table, I was appalled because I knew that the number one opposition to same-sex marriage would be religious institutions. They would bankroll the fight, they would be talking in churches, and I was thinking, okay, logic models, logic theories of change, how can I? And the reason that they came to that was because they had, I think, a very misguided understanding that if they didn't raise the faith question, it wouldn't be raised, right? Because, you know, marriage in a society that was pluralistic and secular, according to their theory, would be only a conversation about civil marriage. Wrong. And so that happened about halfway through the campaign before Prop 8 was voted on. There was a slight course correction to that, and religious communities and religious leaders were brought into the room or into the strategy, but mostly, so I'm not clergy, the clergy would say as sort of, they coined the term rent-a-collar. You know, they would be, where there was a camera, they would be there with their collars and stoles on. When the cameras went off, oh, thank you, oh, I've got to go quicker. they'd be out, and so not in the architecture of the strategy. So when Prop 8 successfully, narrowly passed in California, there was a lot of recrimination against religious institutions, and the three that were blamed, and as a matter of fact, had LGBT people protesting outside of their doors, were Black churches, Mormon churches, and Roman Catholic churches. And so that started a whole dialogue about faith, politics, and equality in California that went on for about 2 years that I'll talk about more at some other point. Thank you.
I'll trust you all the time too. This will not be one story, but I think it will be less than 5 minutes. I grew up in a white evangelical congregation in Raleigh, North Carolina. That was really, growing up in the 80s and 90s, it was one of the congregations where the pamphlets for the Christian right, the voter guides, were being distributed. So in the world that I grew up with, faith and politics were very connected, but faith went directly to socially conservative politics, right? And it wasn't really until, I did my college at Eastern College. Y'all have met Peggy Campolo, who's around here. The evangelical left sort of camped out at Eastern College, and that was where I encountered a different kind of way of connecting a faith that was familiar to me to a politics that was very different from what I grew up with. A politics that was about anti-poverty, that was about anti-racism, that was about, in some cases, anti-war. And in some cases in that community, it was also connected to accepting LGBT folks. That was still not, it was not until several years later that I came out myself as lesbian, right? But part of my own story has been rewiring the way, what faith means, what religion means, and then the possibilities of how it connects to politics. As a person learning, as a PhD student, we're fast forwarding over a lot of stuff. As a PhD student, one of the things I ended up writing about as my dissertation project had a lot to do with the LGBT Religious Archive Network. I met Mark Bowman, and he's like, hey, there's all this stuff that needs to be written about. I don't know that many folks have written about it. So that was also for me a totally mind-blowing realization that so much of what I had learned about how religion and how faith connects to LGBT stuff, a lot of what I learned, and a lot of what, I think even those in progressive faith communities learn, is that religion, Christianity, had to be reformed because it was already anti-gay or anti-queer, right? Part of what I learned was just how much the anti-LGBT tradition, how much of that came to be only in the 20th century. And so what stands as tradition is in fact something that's really relatively new. That we actually have a far more complex tradition than most folks realized. And what I also learned a lot about in the process of doing that work was how much liberal Protestants in particular had been involved. And we heard about that today with Reverend Chuck Lewis and the Council on Religion and the Homosexual. And we heard about that with many of those stories. But even just realizing that in most cities, like it was, as it was the case in San Francisco, that Glide Memorial Church was the place where some of those some of those groups began to get on their feet, politically speaking. It was also true in places like St. Louis, places like Kansas City, places like Raleigh, North Carolina, Dallas, Texas, that in many cases the first gay or lesbian association, or whatever it was being called at the time, and even some of this was pre-gay language, it was homophile association or homosexual organization, got started in a church with the support of a pastor, even if the leaders of those groups were not themselves religious. It was in so many places, the history and the story was that there were religious folks who were involved at the outset, providing forms of support and providing enabling forms of resources. So just to see that we don't think of LGBT movement activism as something that was grounded in faith communities, right? But even just we think of it as a secular movement, and that kind of historically is how things are, and that religion is kind of historically the source of oppression against and resistance. And while that's the dominant story that we see today, what I realize in many ways that story is the result of the 1970s and 80s organizing of the religious right, who pretty successfully seized like the means of production around religion and claimed all of it, right, in terms of public discourse. So that to think differently from them didn't just mean that you were a wrong or a heretical kind of Christian or religious person. It meant that you weren't religious at all, right? They claimed all the religion. And we're still living with the inheritance of that. And I'm realizing how much we're living with the inheritance of that when I teach students who, for the most part, are not religious and are allergic to religion. And when you ask them what they think religion is, they will give you a definition that would pretty much go with the way Christian right activists would define it, right? And so I'm convinced that it's important movement work, it's important like LGBT work, it's activist work, it's it's the work of religious freedom to detoxify and decolonize those definitions of religion. Not only the politics that are connected to them, but the very idea that religion is only this one thing, that faith is only this one thing. And that's most of what my teaching and writing work is about.
Thank you all for coming. We're glad that we have a full room. I must confess, when I was asked to talk about tensions between religion and politics, I had nothing. I mean, I'm not religious per se. I grew up in a Pentecostal home, so talking about traditional. So my pop had an S&M God, and you know, I'm not dealing with that. But I try to have a spiritual life. I try to be Christ-like. You know, Christ for me was not a Christian, so that's what I aim to be. And Christ didn't say a lot in terms of politics per se, but he showed by example. So I can say by example that I work hard and consistently to push the envelope with activists to make sure that older LGBT adults' voices are in the room. Often LGBT elders are not considered when we talk about any kind of issue. So when we talk about housing, when we talk about homelessness, when we talk about bullying, when we talk about health and economic disparities, depending on the audience, we have to bring up the LGBT factor and often bring up the elder factor because, at least in Washington, D.C., where I work. Secondly, I do a lot of political stuff, but I never bring up my faith when I do political stuff. I'm in the room, I'm advocating. I organize witnesses for hearings, I attend the hearings, I testify, I visit city council, I quote lobby, I collaborate with different organizations to make changes, the Office on Aging, to make changes for folks, but rarely do I voice my spiritual leanings. I kind of heard somebody say that they were in the closet about their spiritualness. And I may be in the closet about my spiritualness, it just doesn't come up. I was asked by Reverend Darlene Garner when in the Obama administration to represent MCC during the first White House LGBT health roundtables. And for me, that was, when you talk about tension between religion and politics, that was it. I mean, imagine seeing the White House logo and seeing the acronym LGBT health disparities at the White House. That's some kind of tension, and it was absolutely surreal. But it was a great moment. I guess for me, the religious and political tensions lie within my passion to do the next right thing, and that's my Christ-like thing. You know, to house the homeless, to feed the hungry, to care for old people and children, to remember that the greatest of these is to love one another.
Very, very powerful, and what we've tried to do is sort of offer vignettes or stories to bring you into the conversation. And something about what Imani just said reminded me that for whole groups of people, faith and politics actually don't go together in the same categories, that there's a whole bunch of people who say that these are not connected at all and should not be. And if you, I was a professor for a while, and even in a very liberal institution, I would often get from students, why are we talking about faith and politics with the same breath? And so we want to open the floor up now and see if people have questions or comments, or even short vignettes to share about your own engagement in faith and politics or your perspective on this before we move to the next question. So take a deep breath, think for a moment, and then we want to have some lively conversation. And feel free to ask a question of any of the panelists or all of us. Anyone? I want to use good pedagogy, so I don't want to call anybody's names because I only know a few people and I would be picking on them. So, any comments? Yes. Can you? So we all have to use the mic for, and because I'm seated behind here, it's harder, so you may have to come forward.
For the sake of history.
My name is Drew Kono. Hi. I am currently working at the Religious Institute, and one of the things that you said, Heather, in terms of this idea of religion sort of being in the public understanding seen as sort of one thing, and that there are certain things, particularly progressive forms of faith, that really don't fit into that model. And in terms of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis, one of the things that I do is that I speak with reporters and folks in the media and connect them with faith leaders who are involved in whatever it is that we're doing. And one of the things that I've started to do is I frequently go on background with these reporters and bring up particularly that piece, that what we're doing is not politics cloaked in religion, but is actually something that is deeply religious for all of these reasons. So I think for me it's been helpful and at times successful and times less successful than I would like, but to really acknowledge that that is a educational deficit in a larger culture, as well as in the sort of media that comes out of coverage of these kinds of efforts. So anyway, I was just interested in hearing other kinds of practical strategies that folks have as well.
I'll say one thing I do with my students is a Google exercise, because Google is not neutral. And I begin by saying, okay, take a generic kind of religion and use either LGBT or gay, right? Do a Google search, see what comes up. What's going to be like your first headlines? Invariably, this is conservative Protestants and anti-LGBT perspectives. And then the next thing that they work to do is find specific, like lesbian Muslim, what happens when you start looking for that. And then it's that when you start getting more specific, what you get are faith practitioners from those perspectives that are narrating their own experience. But somehow when what gets reported at the top layer is this generic, and the generic somehow always belongs to conservative Protestant, right? Sometimes Catholic, but conservative always, and usually Protestant. So it's even just doing the education level of like, what do you think generically religion is? What do you think generically something called faith is? What are the attributes you would look for? What attributes do those fit best? What do they not fit? Right? And why is it that sexuality seems to have such a, be such a, the definition of what counts as religion or what isn't religious? Like, how is sexuality wrapped into that, and why does queer stuff always end in the not religion kind of category, and trying to think through that. So I think that's even just an educational piece that I try to work on with students. It just gets at it at a really basic level. What assumptions do we have, and how can we challenge those?
And I would just add to that what I have seen over the course of 15 years is there are these media tropes that just repeat themselves. And the big one is the God versus gay thing. So first of all, not LGBT, but gay. And the story is already written before something happens, that it's God's versus gay. So it means that all of the religious folks are on one side of the argument, and then presumably it's secular, and usually in people's minds, white gay men, who, because that's who's, when they do the God versus gay headline, it's always white gay men that they're picking. And that's not working with communications professionals to expose that story was already written before you knew the facts, right? That's a trope that you've somehow fallen into a very sloppy habit of assuming that all LGBT people are gay and that they're secular and they're not. And there are plenty of studies that show exactly the opposite, that 70% of LGBT people identify with some spiritual or religious tradition. And that even goes against what we who identify as LGBTQI say about ourselves sometimes. And the other one that I found particularly damaging was the black church, and really what they mean is the blacks versus the gays. And that, particularly in Prop 8, that story, even though it was thoroughly debunked. So in California, one of the reasons why I love being on the East Coast now is I could go a long time without seeing a group of black people in California. That's just the reality of where we are in California. We're a diminishing part of the population in California. So the idea that in the biggest state in the country, that black people could sway a vote on same-sex marriage is ludicrous. We can't even vote up in a candidate. And so, but that story was another one that was written, and just despite being thoroughly debunked, every national media outlet, including CNN, kept running black churches are the ones responsible for Prop 8. And as a matter of fact, the Catholic churches in California that registered people in the last month before the vote, that population was 4 times the size of the entire black population of California. And so just helping people in the LGBT community and in the media to break down these tropes that just are sloppy patterns that keep going, I think is a very practical strategy. Good to see you, by the way. You're taller in person than on Skype.
I'm a bit of a let's pretend I don't know I'm using Bible trickery on you kind of person, particularly because the Greek for good news was the same title as the Caesar's paper. And the idea was that the good news of God is way better than this dumb politician, but they just said that by titling the book, right? And so I find that kind of in studying the speeches of the civil rights leaders, MLK was such a genius at this, being able to quote scripture in a way that made it sound like maybe you were just saying something that came out of poetry or your heart, but the people who knew the Bible were going to know. They couldn't argue with you because it came from that really good part. And so I think sometimes a well-placed question can do more work than like a really long sermon. And so what that might look like for me would be to just say, well, Adam, the very first creation, had something chopped off their side that was then declared a woman. It seems to me that my scars are in the same place, and Adam might have been more like me than cisgender people. How do you justify God loving you as a creation? Right? And getting people to think about their bodies, or understanding the transness that's in scripture, but we were trained not to read it that way, right? Uncovering what's always been there, but we forgot, or we read our colonization into it, and finding ways to tell stories from scripture in ways that provoke as often as they console. But you also got to know the other parts, right? You got to know Psalm 30. God's anger lasts a moment, God's love lasts forever. Right? nothing, neither death nor life, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor whatever the stupid thing you voted on was, can ever separate me from the love of God. Right? And in the days when people still think God's Spirit moves with a second, or through election results, we have to, I think, not cede scripture to people who read with diversity dyslexia.
Thank you for that. Other questions, comments? I saw some hands raised here. If not, we'll move to the next big question. Or other scenarios, other folks' stories about how they've been engaged in quote-unquote political work or faith work or the intersection. Anyone? Yes. I really apologize that I can't run around the room and be Oprah.
My name is Jackie Foster, and I live here in St. Louis and pastor Disciples of Christ congregation here. And one of the things that I've been noticing since 2014, certainly after Michael Brown was murdered, but really in this section of the Black Lives Matter movement here, is the stark intersectionality going on in that kind of political engagement. When we are on the streets, that is very much a group led by young queer women, young queer Black women, not solely, but greatly so. And what I see more and more is groups that our society has pitted against each other really growing together in this movement and standing up for each other and standing out in front of the jail waiting for each other to be released after we're arrested. And so, what I wonder about this, I look at that and say, God is doing an incredible thing. God is raising up a new people who are one people in this cry to let my people go. And as I look at the rise in the violence of white nationalists and this political era that we're in that is driving, well, I don't know which is driving which, it's all. What I wonder is what, with these groups having come together, I think there will be negatives as well as positives. Not negatives that were coming together, but a part of the attack on one piece is related to hatred of another piece. And so just, I wonder what some of your thought is about that. And I just see the church, I mean the other piece in that is that the church is very much involved in support of this movement here. And one of the things that happens, at least has happened in our congregation, when after Von Derek Meyer's killing and after the non-indictment back in 2015, as protesters were pouring into our congregation for sanctuary and as we're working on those issues together, then people who felt that they were that the church wasn't a place that was for them began opening up more, you know. So, but kind of back to that question is, what do you see happening with this somewhat new intersectionality?
And in many ways, you've leaped to our third question. However, I want to just ask if anyone wants to comment on this now. Yeah. Can we hold your question, and can you remind us when we get to our third movement? So you please do.
the one quick thing I would say would be yes, and you know the story on the ground. One of my concerns is that I've also read the newspaper articles, the kind of national newspaper articles, where the storyline is different, where there's things like, oh, the Black Lives Movement isn't kind of working with the traditional leadership of the black establishment. They are not working with the church, right? The opposite of what's actually happening on the ground. And I mean, I don't even, how does that happen? That's it.
Okay. Discipline. We've got to move to our second question. Discipline, Randall, discipline. Because I could go through a whole, I could riff on that. Okay. Our next question, but just remind us to come back. That was, all right. The next question for the room, and the panelists will address it first, is what are the challenges or pitfalls that you've encountered in working with at the intersection of faith and politics? Has there been, for example, tension between quote-unquote faith and quote-unquote secular activists? What are the challenges, tensions, pitfalls of doing that? And who would like to start this time? I don't want to always force poor Marco to be the first because he's on my left.
All right, so I'll name the sticky thing that is the big pitfall, and that's when allies become enemies. I've had a couple of experiences with this of late. One was I read in the newspaper that there was a black transgender woman who was arrested in Iowa for essentially making the manager of a hotel uncomfortable on her way to a funeral. And she was subsequently arrested during the time of the late checkout she was given by this angry person for not having the prescription for her hormones with her at the time, and kind of like a bogus giving a different name than your ID kind of charge. And it was entirely unjust in every way. And so she was taken to the jail, where the story in the paper was that, the first sentence of the story was about her private parts on the top and her private parts on the bottom, and how they were searched and who searched them and how terrible this was. And the trans person inside of me who gets touched more often than I want to was like livid, and this was the Midwest, and I was gonna do something about this. And I called the Transgender Law Center, and they said, well, we can't do anything right now because there was a $250 fine that the person couldn't afford to pay that became a $25,000 warrant for their arrest in a different state, but the state wasn't going to extradite them over a $250 nonsense thing, and they were probably going to have to stay for months and months and months in this Iowa jail. And so and they said, but we can't do anything with them legally until these fines are paid. But if you wanted to raise the money for these fines, that would help us out immensely, because then we could get them cleared of these charges. So I did online, and we raised maybe 3 times more than we needed to pay the bails in both states. I worked with her aunt, and we got her court fees dismissed, and we were able to talk whenever we wanted to via Skype at the jail, because it turned out the police officers at the jail thought the trans rules were stupid and were the ones who called the paper in hopes that the policies would change, because they had to enforce them but they couldn't change them, and they wanted them changed, and they were willing to look like jerks in order to get the policy changed. That story didn't make it in the paper. And so we were able to kind of get her bills paid, but so many people had seen, it made national news, it was in the Advocate, and the amounts of money that were raised were there. And so this black trans woman living in poverty who was able to make decisions about herself had people coming to pick her up from the courthouse, because I was very far away and we didn't know when it would happen. And they took her on a shopping spree, and they said, we're paying for everything, don't worry about it. And then they tried to send me a bill, because they knew how much money we had raised. And they were trying to take money from someone who was going to use that money to get the new ID, to pay for legal expenses, to have to travel. And when I didn't reimburse them for their shopping spree, they went online and created a Twitter storm that I was transphobic, that I was stealing a black woman's money, and that everyone should come after me. Like, phone calls throughout the night, every 15 minutes, people trying to hack my bank account to take money from me, death threats to my congregation where we have an infant care system, right? My one rule I have as a trans pastor is my private parts are private, and I'm not going to correct your story about it. But to be declared masculine of center, and thus, I mean, not a way that I identify. If my vagina bleeds, I will identify as a woman, right? That's my theory. But no one cared about my identity. No one cares about more than 140 characters. No one cares about the death threats the next day, and no one cares to figure out the nuances in those intersections of trans people calling other trans people transphobic. And there's no way to get back that fear and that shame and that doubt in your life. And there's only supporting other people when that happens to them. And that's how I became a police chaplain. When I knew what it felt like to always be wearing a uniform where other people had said spiritually abusive things to other people, when the LGBT police officers said, we want someone who gets us to minimally be there at our funeral, let alone provide us care for how hard it is to try to be a part of the system and create change from the inside, that I couldn't say no to them, regardless of what it would mean for more people being pissed off for working inside of a terrible institution, but that the scars that I built from the unfair criticism made it possible for me to put on a uniform and all of the doubt and the shame, to not remind people of my black kids that I tell, not to play with their gun Legos outside, but to be there and to be a pastor truly to these people, and to be someone willing to listen at the first interviews of officer-involved shootings, to take in, as a white person, the repenting we have to do for white supremacy, but also the moral guilt and shame and doubt we have put on people who have to make these decisions. And so stepping into that complicated space is terrifying, stupid, and needed.
We could do an interview
Right?
with you for the trial.
No.
I have a lot of questions. So, anyone else want to respond to the question about the tensions and challenges that people have seen? I will just briefly say that the idea of the church as a base for liberation is, I think, a strange one in the LGBTI context. And I was with a colleague a couple of months ago, and it was a gathering, and he's queer himself, so I don't know why he was asked if he was going to do the answer, but he said, I don't know why, in these contexts when we're working for liberation, people are so suspicious of the church and so suspicious of what I'm doing there. And I gave him the answer that I knew that he already knew, that as a matter of fact, the church has a lot of atoning to do. And that if we're going to be a part of the liberation struggles, so I identify as a church person, despite what I said about being closeted. I've been an active church person for 50 years, but then we probably are not going to be the ones that take the lead, that we are there to be in partnership, particularly straight allies, that there's a kind of humility that we go into these struggles with, knowing that there's a deep level of suspicion and a reasonable suspicion and skepticism about church people who all of a sudden want to be on the side of LGBTQIA people. And so it requires, I think, a level of humility and generosity as people demand that you prove that, you know, against the dominant narrative that's out there, that you aren't those kind of church people. Because, and I think that's entirely fine. That if you're asking me as a church person to repent of 2,000 years of bad Christianity, that seems right to me. That seems, you're right, you know, because I affiliate myself with this institution and it's done bad things to LGBTQI people, among others. And so therefore, yeah, I get it. I've got to prove that, you know, I'm doing the right thing and on the right side, even as a black queer man with seminary training. Are you afraid?
Is the church only one thing?
Right.
Yes.
No, I'm shaking my head
Okay.
at the question. No, I'm not saying.
Because I guess I'm surprised to hear the necessity to atone for 2,000 years of Christendom because you identify with the institution. Because I don't know that, and I say this actually as, I don't know if I'm a Christian, right? So I don't know if I'm defending Christianity or not. But as I observe things, there's not just one church, there's not just one Christianity, and the problem is that the Christendom that needs defending from the evils has often done those evils onto other members of its communities, right? And why aren't those people the church? And why isn't? Yeah, I don't know that you can.
Yeah.
You can feel responsibility for that if you want, but I'm just surprised that.
No, I do, and I often say to my students, you should too, because it's like being a black Republican. No offense to anybody Republicans. No offense to any Republicans in the room. But this is where we are in the black liberation struggle, according to Randall. If you're proudly saying you're a black Republican, then you better explain why and how that works. And similarly, I think that at this moment of history, and this moment is all of my life, the Protestant Christian churches that I know best are predominantly anti-LGBT, that even those who've changed their policies in the last 15 years have a good journey to go. And so if I, in the context particularly of the Bay Area, which is my spiritual and geographical home, even though I live in New York now, where the most unchurched part of the country is the West Coast, and people have gone to the West Coast because they didn't want religion to influence their lives. So in the context of that and meaningful conversation, I think I have to explain why it is that I affiliate myself with an institution that by and large is homophobic. And that's both my specific institution. We have anti-LGBT policies in the United Methodist Church. Now I've worked against them for most of my life, but I'm still a tithe-paying member of the United Methodist Church. And as long as it's oppressing people and I stay in the pew, there's atonement for me to do. Now I put multiple identities, so the United Methodist Church oppressed black people too. So I don't engage in pyramids of oppression or hierarchy, but you've got a little more atoning to do than I do, is what I think to my colleagues. So, but anyway, so that's why, and as a ethicist and theologian, I completely agree that there's different forms. But I've learned in the public space that people have one kind of conception of church, and that as long as I'm kind of waving that flag, I've got to give some explanation about why it is that I actively choose to be a part of it, even if I'm the counter-revolution, if I'm part of the revolution in the church. Anyway, that's my response. But only mine. Other folks can say whatever they want about that. Other tensions?
Sure. The main tension that comes across for me oftentimes, and I apologize, it's resting on you. I can't tell you how many times people want to separate church and state as if we had a real problem with that. there's two parts to that, right? So whenever I'm speaking, people want to say, no, we can't lobby for hungry people, because that would be wrong. We don't want to talk about politics in the church. There are two parts to the constitutional argument in the First Amendment. One is anti-establishment. We do not want a national church. There should not be a national church. And the other one is the free exercise clause. And it seems that an awful lot of people will want one more than the other, right? They would love for the government to be more engaged in religion, right? But they don't want other people to exercise their freedom to organize in their own way or to experience God in their own way. So they pretend that one is appropriate and that the other is not. And I really do struggle with it. So much so, I think the best one example I ever ran into was I probably preached the only sermon, I don't know, this was the safest, middle of the road, milquetoast sermon I ever preached because it was easy. I picked Matthew 25 as my gospel message, and I was preaching at a really strong Bread for the World church in Houston, Texas. And so here I preached on Matthew 25, and I taught, when did you see me hungry? When did you see me naked? When did you visit me in prison? And at the end, I'm shaking hands as people leave, and someone comes to me and says, that was the worst condemnation I've ever experienced in this congregation. How dare you come here and lecture us about being good Christians? And I thought, my gosh, there's a lot of baggage coming with you today, right? So I think the kinds of pushback that we get in these settings where we're claiming our own faith and trying to use that to inform our actions in the world often pushes other people's buttons, whether it's LGBTQ buttons or whether it's anti-hunger buttons or anti-poverty buttons. We're pushing people's buttons. I knew that when I was writing the sermon. I didn't think this one was pushing as many buttons as I did, but I think that happens an awful lot. And so, I think that when we do speak publicly on these issues, or when we are trying to help people move past the point where they are in life and perhaps to another understanding of things, we should be very self-aware, because sometimes those things also result in outcomes that we didn't predict and maybe didn't want as much.
You want to speak to this, either of you? You're good? Okay. All right. I'm sure with that SM God that you talked about earlier, I thought you'd have a big thing about the tension of faith and politics. Oh, we have plenty of time, so we don't want to, I'm not pressuring you, but you have time to speak.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to say that, in churches, when we talk about affirming churches, there's still that systemic racism in there, and internal homophobia or systemic homophobia. And I don't like to say homophobia. I think people are scared. I just think people are hateful, so let's just say oppression. And there's a lot of that within the churches that people are going to that are affirming that the places, and it's from the top, but it's those people who are saying, we're not racist. And then there are people who say, like me, but it looks like a rose, it smells like a rose, so I'd just like to open that up for some kind of response. I see heads nodding.
You're thinking about responding? Okay.
I'll say I think about that question. How do I try to separate myself from racism, right? And how do I do that in ways that reinforce white supremacy, right? I think about that in my classrooms, which are predominantly white, in a private college, which is also predominantly white, in Tacoma, Washington, in the Pacific Northwest, which is also predominantly white. And we also know that that area of the country is predominantly white because of sundown laws and all kinds of things. That's part of the racial history of places outside of the South. But where I think of it in particular is when I promise my predominantly white queer students that this space is a safe space. Like, safe spaces, so this is a bit of a riff. I think one of the things that I really, really want to think about is what secures the safe space for mostly white folks, and how do those things connect to racism and white supremacy. And I think probably folks who are not white in the room could answer that question far more readily than I could as a white person. And my difficulty in answering that question, we know why that is, right? Is because I don't have to answer that question on a regular basis. So that's part of my response to it.
I'll never forget, as a professor, I used to teach a course, an advanced level course on social justice, and one of the assignments was to go out and interview someone in the congregation about what social justice was. And one of my students came back and said, some guy, like an anchor person in the church, just reamed me out for talking about social justice. And I said, okay, this was the era when that guy, I can't even remember his name anymore, was on, not Fox, but MSNBC, and was saying social justice was made up by the left, and if your church says social justice, run out the door. It's like, really? And so I thought that was it, and I said, but in the same interview that he did, this man was completely passionate about LGBT issues. And so I said, well, this guy is saying no social justice, but he's talking about LGBT issues. And the student said, yeah, exactly. And so, and what I finally understood was in this guy's head, and I never met the guy, I was only reading the interview, LGBT issues were separate than questions of social and economic justice. And he could be 110% supportive of LGBTQ people and not really violently opposed, as violently as people in liberal Protestant churches get about economic justice. It's sort of like Marco's story. It's like, really, just the word social justice triggers you to lecture this poor student who's asking you privately about that. And that's a phenomena, I think, that those of us engaged in LGBTQ organizing work have to begin to address. And that's what people younger than I mean about the seeds of pink washing. That if you're good on LGBTQ issues, you're okay, and that's the only thing you have to be good at, right? You don't have to be good at economic justice or other social, just be good on and you'll be our hero or shiro if you just say you're inclusive. Is that really where we are in terms of faith and politics? So we want to throw a question out to you about sort of what are the tensions that you've observed around the intersection of faith and politics, and what keeps you up at night or in your afternoon nap. In the back, would you mind walking forward?
I don't mind.
Hi, I'm Helen. I am and have been for the last 12 or 14 years in the United Methodist Church, so I'm a Christian faith-oriented person. And the thing that's going through my mind is a couple of things. One is, Randall, you had said about the need for LGBT, and I identify as agender and queer, I think. Yes, that's right. The thing that's, two things running through my mind. One is, you mentioned the need for LGBTQI faith people to take responsibility for some of the atonement and repentance that needs to go, because we're aligned with those churches, and then which have done harm. And then expanding that out to something Imani said, and then Heather said is around, and as a white person, therefore, be prepared to repent and atone for, or name the continued white supremacy and racism that exists in our churches, and as a socioeconomically privileged person. So there are just layers upon layers. So then we can keep going through that. So that leads me to this sort of idea of the church as essentially just such a broken institution that is it redeemable at all? Is it worth redeeming? And if it is, how do we go about doing that? And then particularly from a Christian perspective, one of the things that I've been really kind of wrestling with of late is there's a lot in our faith tradition around, and I know others have thought about this more, and there are probably answers, but this is where I'm at, is in our Christian faith tradition there's a lot about turning the other cheek and blessing those who curse you and praying for your enemies, and there's layers and layers and layers of that which we are taught are admirable qualities, fruits of the Spirit, things to search after and yearn after. And yet when do we get to the point where, is there ever a point at which we say, no, this is now harmful? No, naming the harm and naming the truth that these are the things that we're supposed to lean into. And that's where I'm finding the tension. So from the political point of view, and just from the church, how do we continue to work into these institutions where the values that we're being taught are kind of maybe not even helping us get to the place we need to get because of it. So there's no answers in that, but these are just thoughts.
Did you want someone from the panel to dialogue with you?
I'd love
Does
to
anyone want to take that on?
anyone who has anything to say would be great.
Oh, yes, thank you.
I'm Fran Bogle. I'm an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. And I think we do have to take it on. The Jesus that I trust walks beside me, or in whose footsteps I try to walk, is the one who turned over the tables in the temple. Well, and a friend of mine said Jesus died so we don't have to. Jesus went to the cross so we don't have to keep going to the cross. And that, I think, talks to some of that text that says, turn the other cheek and keep doing the work for justice that may lead you to get struck, but it's okay to keep doing the work. And I think there is a time to fight back, because we're not 2,000 years ago today. Jesus was preaching about a kingdom that I believe, at least he thought, was coming very soon. 2,000 years, some people say is a blink in God's eye, but it's a long time. And it's okay to say I'm working as a person of faith for a realm that can be here and now, if we were to create it based on the love that God keeps talking about to us over and over again, from Genesis, all the way through traditional Holy Scriptures, to a God who still speaks to us today in the text that we've heard from so many people, from Audre Lorde, from Dolores Williams, from Carter Hayward, from the saints we named at the beginning of this conference. So I want to lift that up, that our faith says, love, live, be bold, say no to the people in power, and dare to create another vision. That's what I lift up as a Christian.
Yeah, the gentle person behind you.
I don't think it goes.
No,
Oh,
the
there you
gentle
go.
person.
Thank you. Actually, that has to do with some of my wrestling. I'm Jackie Belisle, American Baptist minister, serving in Chicago, with a gentle temperament. And I think, help me sew this together. Because I think if I were to articulate the tensions that keep me up, make me wrestle, it is how I really feel as the disciple embodied to be me in my tradition, around our legislative victories, right? Around the effort to secure the equality and protection that I and my family have longed for all these years, right? I've first wedding ceremony in 1992, unthinkable that we would be legally married and protected today, right?
Yeah.
Of course I rejoice in that. Of course. Of course I'm afraid about backlash and regression. Of course. There's this other instinct in me, informed by my tradition, which is not about not being bold, but which is about being sensitive to not wanting to coerce others or objectify others. I mean, of course, that's, I don't know if you'd call it trope, but or trait, but I mean, of course, that's an ugly opponent talking point, right? That we're forcing something upon others, you know. And of course, I don't believe we're forcing, right? But I wrestle with what does it mean to really uphold a non-coercive spirit as I live my life, and as I make testimony, and as I work for change. I think the religious freedom language and backlash is, bullshit mostly. Bullshit. And I don't know, this is for the panel, I don't know how I can in good conscience say that a family, a business, a community exercising their religious freedom does not include some kind of ability to draw boundaries around their association. That's what keeps me up at night.
Yes, you mind walking forward?
Thank you. My name is Ray Bagdewall, and I'm a Presbyterian minister serving a UCC church with dual standing. Just two quick thoughts. One is that turning over the table, from what I recall and have read, there was nobody sitting on the table that Jesus overturned. So there's something there about that. And then the other thing is, if we want our kids to be well educated, we make sure we get them to a place where there's good teachers. And I think that who we call to serve as ministers and pastors is really important. I don't see the degradation of the church, but I do see that we need really good ministers, pastors, and how we can do that in some way to provoke that, to help that to happen, I think is part of what's important going forward.
Others, do you mind jumping forward? And why don't we, I don't want to start a line, but it would actually be helpful if people wanted to speak both come forward at the same time. We will save a little bit of time if it's not awkward for you.
My name is Dakota Roberts, and I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana. I might be the only or the least educated religiously person in here as just a congregant, but and maybe the youngest too. But my question is mainly as someone who used to identify while I was in the closet as a conservative, which sounded contradictory at the time, which I now know is a whole movement. There is a whole movement of LGBT folks that support 45. We won't say his name in here, but I have a difficult time relating my, coming out as gay and Democrat at the same time to my formerly Republican friends who stay there but are supportive of my LGBT status. And how do you, and maybe sort of that reconciliation of, we all come from, all of the people sitting in this room identify as, we have social justice issues, race, LGBT, social status, whatever, but are we putting labels on the thems that are opposing us? Oh, they're conservatives, or they're the religious right, or, So I just wanted to know how you think you reconcile those sort of relationships.
Someone want to respond?
I'll just quickly respond by saying my favorite sentence in all of Scripture is, "And then God changed God's mind." And then reading what happened before that and what happened after that. And maybe part of the answer to the how can we be angry question is looking to the prophets. When the people change their mind, like Jonah gets real pissed off because they listen to him and change, and then God doesn't punish them. And being the truth keeper is not fun, and you know how community is going to be after that, but Jonah goes and pouts that they changed their mind because he told them to. And how can we be people who, instead of shaming people for changing their mind on a different timeline than we wanted, be people who rejoice when people change their mind? Because if we don't, we're Jonah hiding in a bush, and God takes the bush away.
So one of my best friends from high school is, he was on the football team. In fact, he was the center. He's a really big, stocky guy. He's got 2 kids, and they're the same thing, right? Just like him, except that now they're playing college ball. And he and his husband live in Pflugerville, Texas, for God's sake. God bless them. He is a very conservative person who also chose to vote for someone other than I did. And so I often think about, well, what would Ivy say, right? When I'm thinking, and so it's a really helpful little thought bubble in the back of my head to ask myself, what would Ivy say about this? What are the, and I have to go to figure out what are the values that Ivy holds that are important to him? Because if I want a productive conversation, I find it far more useful to talk about values than about political ideology. It gets me a lot further. So I get to talk to a lot of Latino evangelical leaders, and they're very conservative, right? Especially the Pentecostals and the holiness movement. They have a bigger issue with me being a Democrat than with me being a gay man. But usually what I have to do is spell out what the values are that underpin the decisions I've made, and then ask them about their values and ask them to talk with me about what we can do to try we usually find at least 80 to 90% agreement on the values that we hold as important in our lives as Christians. And it's just a better conversation to begin with for me in my life.
I was talking with someone earlier, right before this session. So for me, the Jesus thing, or the Jesus way, and use the language that a lot of evangelicals use now, means that is a hard way. So it means not engaging in dialogue, holding your truth, and doing the best you can not to dehumanize the people who hate you. And because I think Martin Luther King was right, that buried in the Jesus way and the Gandhi way is this understanding that how you treat others is the way that you feel about yourself. And so that part of liberation is staying engaged in conversation and trying to see the people who you're talking to as human as possible, and practicing that very, very difficult art of forgiveness, whatever that looks like. And that's for LGBTQI people, that Jesus way is pretty hard, you know, but that's how I kind of understand what Jesus is saying about even overturning tables. And so still staying engaged and finding ways to talk about your truths, even beyond the LGBTQI stuff. So now being the lone Democrat and how you bridge that, I can't help you with, but then there's a way of doing that. And I just want to say to the question about religious exemption, so because I'm doing a lot of work on that. So first of all, using religion to discriminate people is not new in the United States. We've kind of forgotten that there was a religious argument for discriminating against black people. And we have to make a decision, I think. Are we in a theocracy in the US? Is that what we're saying? And if we are in a theocracy, you know, we're religionists in the room, most of us. So if we want to live in a theocracy, I think we have to ask ourselves, so why do adulterers get a cake made for them, but married LGBT people don't get a cake? So I don't want to live in a theocracy, but for people who are imagining that we do, that's the question. So why have you singled out this sin, you'll make a cake for the robber, the alcoholic, the adulterer, the person who beats their spouse, but it's the two people who are celebrating an act of love of the same gender that you. So, but we don't live in a theocracy, so that we live in a different thing, and the question is a commercial transaction that's supposed to be agnostic of whoever you serve, is that an endorsement of whatever is happening, right? Because, and it's beyond us. Should you be, pharmacist, the person who decides whether someone can get a birth control pill? And if you are, who elected you to do that? What qualifications do you have to be, because you have personal moral objectives? Well, don't take the pill then. That's how you, but you don't, you're in a business where you have said, and where legally you're obligated to serve everyone. And so I just don't want to confuse those things. Of course I have all sorts of prejudices. And so if I was running a shop, there are plenty of people I would not want to come into my shop, and they are unreasonable prejudices. Apologies to people in the South, but I'm sorry, when I hear a Southern white accent, it drives me batty. And if my lower lizard brain self was running a shop, I would not serve Southern white people solely on the basis of their voice. That's how unreasonable my lower brain lizard self is. But I know Jesus and my teachers have told me that that lower lizard brain self doesn't get to make the rules about who gets what in society. And so I'm expecting the same of you. I know you got lower lizard brain stuff happening, but why should I let that determine whether I could get a cake? And I just have to say, in the Colorado thing that's going through the Supreme Court, the masterpiece cake thing about, the guy sold that couple cakes before when they were an unmarried. They showed up and you made a cake and you had no objection to two gay men coming in buying just a regular old cake. So what is it about now this ceremony? Oh, no, that's the cake I can't. No. I just think we have to be clear about what is a very cynical reframing of discrimination that would not be, where's my sister that would not be before us if a whole bunch of religious right organizations weren't very cynically funding that. You know, the Colorado Civil Rights Commission said this is a violation of our state law. The Colorado Supreme Court said, no, you can't. You don't have any right to bake a cake and then say it's artistic expression, and so you're going to deny it to people. What the hell is a cake? It would have died there had not other well-funded opposition people stepped in to move it forward. And they did it because they're not able yet to move forward religious freedom arguments. So they came up, sorry, my religious friends, with this bullshit argument about artistic expression. Really? The design you put on, you know, I make cakes too, but I don't say, well, this is my piece of art and I don't want you to eat it because you're a Southern white person. And for you to eat my piece of art would be just moral. That's what we're faced with. And so religious freedom is a very difficult issue, but we've got to see through when it's a very cynical attempt to reframe discrimination. And so the last thing I'll say, cut me off if the last thing I'll say is that just that Martin Luther King made this distinction about how we move forward. So on a legal basis, we do legal stuff to ensure that everyone is treated the same, and we don't wait for people to feel like we're equal before everyone gets to be treated the same. And then for those who have patience and love, King said, then you go and you find a way to persuade them that you're equal as well. But don't wait on that, because that might be a long time. People might not want to rent places to black people, but the law says you have to, right? And I don't have the patience to do it. Someone out there do the work of convincing people to rent to black people. I'm not going to do that. But in the meantime, we have the law. And the law says you should be renting to anyone. So anyway.